Hey there, this is John Evans, and welcome back to Book Spade. Very glad to be with you finally in person after so many months. We are recording on behalf of the feast day of St. Patrick, and I believe that we could take some important lessons from this historical figure and as an example of where we stand in today's cultural battles. Patrick was born into a life of some comfort and some luxury. He was born into Britain sometime in the late 5th, early 6th century. He seemed to have a father who was a deacon. This term may have implied a tax collector, or it may have implied a member of the church hierarchy. But he certainly lived in a household that may have had household servants, may have had some level of simplicity. And yet we know that from a very early age, Patrick was captured by Irish raiders, sold into slavery in Ireland, forced to tend sheep, and brought to the lowest form of servitude. He was captured by a people he did not know, had to learn a language that he did not necessarily know, and encounter a culture which he never would have otherwise encountered. And yet, it was during this period, tending the sheep of his slave master, that at some point in that process, like David before him who composed the Psalms, the voice of God reached into the heart of this young man. He began to learn the customs of this people and eventually come to love the people who he was taken into bondage into. Patrick was led by that celestial voice of Jesus Christ out of the land of Ireland, back to Britain, back to his hometown, where he thought he would live a quiet life. We can think of the experience of those in North American slavery in the 19th century, like Frederick Douglass, escaping servitude, looking for freedom, and yet a figure like Harriet Tubman returning back to free other souls. Because what Patrick fundamentally did is he didn't remain in his comfy hometown. Instead, he had a vision where the people who he had formerly served came to him and said, "Oh, holy youth, come and rescue us. Come and preach the gospel to us." He traveled across the channel to France, to Gaul, where he learned at the feet of Bishop Germanus. And from Germanus, the great and mighty orator, he learned Latin. He learned the full teachings of the church to a greater degree, and he acquired his priesthood. And it was from there he made a bold and courageous decision, not to remain as a parish priest, not to remain as a man of some means and some luxury, but to empty himself of these rights and duties, and to return back to Ireland to preach the good news. He would return to a culture that practiced things like infanticide, the murder of unwanted children, a vast society with warring clans and tribes which perhaps may have practiced adult human sacrifice, and a culture which lived in fear of their many gods, gods of the earth, wind, air, and fire. And yet, because Patrick had previously come to know and love this culture, what was good in it, he could use what was best in that culture to present the person of the everlasting God. Now we can see the fruits of his labor, and we can see that from east to west, the memory of Patrick is revered. As we stand on today's feast, we look at a world that is washed in many of the errors Patrick came to combat. The culture of death, which sees the human person as an object rather than a person made in the image and likeness of love, reigns supreme. And there are many who would seek to live in lives of somewhat comfort and in their own shells. And yet we have been taken into a captivity in the year 2020. I know that my own experience of isolation has been at times admittedly mind-bogglingly frustrating, and a time which has forced me to revisit the roots not only of our faith, but also too of reason and ways we can communicate both faith and reason to this generation. If we could live as Patrick, finding what is good in these present times, and finding what is best in the present society, we could communicate through those channels, like this digital one, to try to reach souls with this radical message that from the lowest possible person in the eyes of the culture to the most admired, that individual has been purchased with the highest price, with the blood of love incarnate shed upon the cross. You know, one of the great mysteries, of course, is the shamrock. This is a rather late legend, probably from the 17th or 18th century. But we all know the idea that both three leaves could be of the same stem, in the same way that all three persons of the Trinity could be of the same substance. What is actually known, however, is there is a poem called the Lorica of St. Patrick. Most scholars reject this. I personally believe it's real, where Patrick actually gives a blessing on himself and on his followers. And he begins with these lines: I arise today through mighty strength, through the invocation of the Trinity, through confession of the oneness, through belief in the threeness of the Creator of creation. And he goes on to describe the goodness of rock, of leaves, of trees, of wind and air and fire. What he does is he points out to his pagan listeners, look around you at all that you worship. In and of themselves, these things are good. They're good gifts. However, they themselves are not the highest good. They come from the gift giver, he who is the author of love itself. So can we see the Creator, the everlasting one, through these good gifts so we can appreciate them in their right order? He then goes on to actually pronounce a blessing on his servants to protect them from the attacks of the evil one. And although perhaps some of our listeners don't share the Judeo-Christian worldview, we do live in a time of genuine cosmic evil and malevolence that is not merely material, but also too spiritual. And you know what Patrick does towards the end of this beautiful poem is he reminds us that we ourselves are called to have a rendezvous with destiny, with love himself, with Jesus Christ. And if we genuinely do believe that the servant will be like his master, and that we are called forth to bear witness to that light in a generation of darkness, then we can see how sufferings, trials, and tribulations are in some sense inevitable. Patrick never wanted to be a slave tending sheep on a smelly farm in a country he never quite knew. And yet it was out of that experience that he became the great apostle of the Irish. We ourselves are brought into trying times where brother and sister are often divided, where parent is often divided with child, when employment and questions of political alliance divide this beautiful land of ours. And yet if we can, as we are seeing more and more, discover the roots of that union with divine love himself, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, then we can perhaps encounter, as did Patrick, not a deficit, but an opportunity to be voices of that grace. This, of course, is a journey, and I am as much a part of that journey with you as someone who is simply commentating on it. I ask for your continued prayers as we continue in this year of 2021, Anno Domini. And my hope is that all people of goodwill viewing this might be stirred up to ask further questions, as I hope you will in the comment section, and encourage us in healthy, positive, and constructive discourse towards understanding the truth. And we confess that that truth is not only knowable, but has come himself. We hope that you have a blessed St. Paddy's Day, a safe St. Paddy's Day, and we hope that all is well with you. God bless.